Man hands over condoms to police officers instead of driving licenses. The end would shock you. A man gets pulled over for speeding, nervously reaches for his license, and hands the cop a condom instead. What starts as an awkward moment quickly unravels into a powerful story of second chances, regrets, and forgiveness. Cora, haunted by a painful past, never thought he'd see Monique, the love he lost, ever again. But a compassionate cop and one strange twist of fate bring them together in ways he never expected. If this is your first time here on our channel, be sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss out on our amazing stories. Now, let's jump into the full story. Cora gripped the steering wheel tightly as he sped down the nearly empty road. The hum of his old, weathered car filled the silence around him. The city lights blurred past, casting shadows over his face as he lost himself in his thoughts. 50 years of life had given him plenty to think about, and tonight, with the envelope resting on the passenger seat, he felt the weight of those years pressing down on him harder than ever. He had written the letter a week ago, but tonight, something felt different. For years, he'd been avoiding a particular corner of his past. A painful, heart-wrenching memory that he had never truly let go of. But with each passing day, the thought of making amends became harder to ignore. This letter was his last shot at closure, his final attempt to bring peace to a wound that never quite healed. Cora hadn't noticed he was pushing the speed limit. He was too caught up in his own mind, the sounds of the road muffled as his memories played out like a silent film in his head. Suddenly, flashing red and blue lights lit up his rearview mirror, breaking his trance. A sharp pang of anxiety gripped his chest. He checked his speedometer and cursed under his breath. "Great," he muttered. "Just what I need tonight." As he slowly pulled over to the side of the road, his heartbeat quickened. He'd been in situations like this before, but tonight was different. Tonight, he felt vulnerable, stripped bare, with his emotions hanging by a thread. He glanced at the envelope on the seat beside him, its contents bearing the words he'd wrestled with for years. Would this cop be sympathetic? Or would he be another person who saw him as just another man who'd lost his way? The patrol car pulled up behind him, and Cora took a deep breath, his eyes fixated on the approaching figure. Officer Filibert, a tall black man in his mid-30s with a stern yet tired expression, walked towards Cora's car. Filibert's shift was supposed to end 20 minutes ago, but he couldn't ignore the speeding car that zipped past him. Now all he wanted was to get through the stop, file the paperwork, and call it a night. Cora rolled down his window, his hands trembling slightly as he watched the officer approach. Filibert stopped beside the window, his expression unreadable. "License and registration, please," Filibert requested, his voice steady and authoritative. Cora nodded, fumbling as he reached into the glove compartment. His fingers were shaky, and he could feel the sweat starting to bead on his forehead. He was so distracted by his thoughts that, without realizing it, he handed Filibert an item from his glove compartment, a condom packet. Filibert stared at the item for a moment, his eyebrows arching in surprise. Cora looked down, his face flushing with embarrassment as he realized his mistake. He quickly snatched the packet from Filibert's hand, chuckling nervously. "Sorry, officer," he stammered. "Not exactly what you were looking for." "Huh?" Filibert's expression remained stoic, though a hint of amusement flickered in his eyes. "No, sir. Definitely not what I was expecting." Cora cleared his throat, desperately trying to regain his composure as he retrieved his actual driver's license and registration. He handed them over, offering an apologetic smile, but Filibert's gaze lingered on him for a moment longer than necessary. As he scanned the documents, Filibert couldn't help but notice the nervous energy radiating from Cora. There was something off, something more than just a casual traffic violation. Years of working the streets had trained Filibert to pick up on subtle cues, and Cora's behavior was sending up more red flags than he cared to admit. "Sir, you seem a bit distracted," Filibert remarked, handing back the documents. "Is everything okay?" Cora hesitated, the question striking a chord he hadn't anticipated. He nodded, forcing a weak smile. "Yeah, officer. Just A lot on my mind tonight. Filibert glanced at the passenger seat, noticing the sealed envelope resting there. His curiosity piqued. There was a heaviness in Cora's voice that went beyond the embarrassment of handing over the wrong item. Filibert knew better than to pry, but something told him this wasn't a typical traffic stop. Well, keep your eyes on the road, Filibert said, maintaining his professional tone. But if there's something bothering you, driving fast isn't going to make it go away. Cora nodded, grateful for the officer's advice. He was about to put the car in gear and drive off when Filibert's voice stopped him. Actually, sir, I'm going to need you to step out of the car. Cora's stomach dropped. Cora's heart raced as he processed the officer's words. He hadn't expected to be asked out of the car, not over a speeding ticket. His fingers tightened around the steering wheel for a moment as he took a steadying breath. The envelope on the passenger seat felt as though it weighed 100 pounds, a tangible reminder of the reason he was out here tonight. He glanced at Filibert's calm, expectant face through the open window. Is there a problem, officer? Cora asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Filibert shook his head. Not if you cooperate. I'd just like to have a quick word outside the vehicle. Reluctantly, Cora unfastened his seatbelt and opened the door. The cool night air washed over him as he stepped onto the pavement, the distant hum of city traffic filling the silence between them. Filibert motioned for Cora to walk over to the side of the car, where they could speak away from the vehicle. Look, I didn't mean to cause any trouble, Cora began, his eyes flickering nervously to the envelope visible on his passenger seat. He was desperate to get this interaction over with and be on his way, but Filibert's steady gaze told him there would be no rushing. I understand that, Filibert replied, his voice level. But you seem distracted, and as a matter of protocol I have to make sure everything is safe and secure. You handed me something by accident just now, and I think there's more going on here than just a traffic stop. Am I right? Cora's mind scrambled for a response. He could brush it off, pretend nothing was wrong, but the weight of the envelope and the purpose of his journey gnawed at him. He realized, reluctantly, that Filibert wasn't going to let him go without some kind of explanation. He could feel the officer's trained eyes assessing him, taking in every subtle shift in his demeanor. It's personal, Cora finally admitted, his voice quieter now, almost apologetic. Just something from my past that I'm trying to put behind me tonight. Filibert's gaze softened, though his posture remained professional. That envelope, is that what you're talking about? Cora nodded slowly. Yeah. It's a letter for someone I haven't seen in years. Someone I hurt a long time ago. Filibert nodded thoughtfully, considering Cora's words. The tension between them seemed to ease, but only slightly. Cora could see that the officer was still on alert, studying him as if piecing together a puzzle. The uncomfortable silence stretched until Cora, feeling the weight of his own nervousness, attempted to break it. Look, officer, he said with a weak chuckle, rubbing the back of his neck. I know the whole condom incident was probably as strange for you as it was for me. Not exactly how I wanted tonight to go. Filibert's stern expression cracked, and a small smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. Yeah, that was unexpected, to say the least, he replied, shaking his head. In my years on the force, I can say that's a first. Cora chuckled, the laughter bubbling up unexpectedly. For a moment, the heavy air lightened, and the two men found themselves sharing a strange, if brief, connection through the odd mishap. Filibert's stance relaxed a little, and he even let out a small laugh, which surprised them both. But the relief was short-lived, and Filibert's face quickly returned to its serious expression. Listen, he said, his voice steady but gentle. I'm not here to pry into your business, but you're out here in the middle of the night, speeding with that letter on your seat. I've seen this kind of thing before, and it doesn't always end well. Cora's laughter faded, replaced by a look of weary resignation. He knew what Filibert was hinting at. To the officer, he probably looked like a man on the edge, someone about to do something he might regret. The thought stung, but he understood why Filibert was concerned. It's not like that, Cora assured him, his voice low and sincere. "This letter, it's for someone I wronged a long time ago. I need to make things right. This is my last shot at closure." Filibert studied him for a moment, weighing his words carefully. He could see that Cora's determination was genuine, and the pain in his eyes hinted at something much deeper than a mere speeding violation. Filibert softened, nodding slowly. "All right," he said. "I get it. But let me give you some advice. Driving recklessly won't help you get there faster. Take it slow and be careful. Sometimes closure is closer than you think." Cora felt a wave of relief wash over him. Filibert's words were surprisingly understanding, and Cora sensed a shift in the officer's approach. Yet, just as he thought he'd be allowed to leave, Filibert's gaze shifted back to the envelope resting on the passenger seat. His eyes narrowed, and the look of concern returned. "Look, Cora," Filibert said, using his name for the first time. "Just to be safe, I'm going to need to take a look inside your vehicle. Call it a precaution." Cora's relief quickly morphed into unease. He knew there was nothing dangerous or illegal in the car, but the envelope contained deeply personal words he'd struggled to put on paper. The thought of someone else reading them, even just the envelope itself, made his chest tighten. "Is that really necessary?" he asked, his tone edging on pleading. Filibert nodded, his expression soft but resolute. "I know this might feel invasive, but I've got my protocols. This won't take long." Cora sighed, then nodded, stepping back as Filibert moved to the passenger side. Filibert opened the door and carefully reached for the envelope, giving it a brief glance before setting it aside. Then he scanned the interior, his eyes moving across the back seat and floor. Aside from a few scattered receipts and an old baseball cap, there was nothing out of the ordinary. Yet, even as he finished his search, Filibert's gaze kept drifting back to the envelope. He held it for a moment, as though weighing its significance. Cora felt his heart pound as he watched, the weight of his own secrets growing heavier with each passing second. Curiosity getting the better of him, Filibert asked, "So, this letter, if you don't mind me asking, is it for someone close to you?" Cora hesitated, the emotions bubbling within him making it difficult to speak. "Yeah, someone I cared about a long time ago. Monique. She was everything to me back then. But things didn't end well." Filibert's face softened, a hint of empathy flickering in his eyes. "And you're hoping this letter will make things right?" Cora nodded slowly. "I have to try. She deserves to know I'm sorry, even if it's too late." For a moment, Filibert stood silent, considering Cora's words. Then, with a solemn nod, he placed the envelope back on the seat and closed the door. "All right," he said. "I'll let you go. But remember what I said. Take it slow. Some things aren't meant to be rushed." Cora exhaled slowly as he climbed back into his car, glancing once more at the envelope on the seat beside him. The words inside felt heavier than ever, like they held years of his life and all the regrets he'd buried deep. He started the engine, determined to drive carefully as Filibert had advised. Yet his mind continued to spin, thoughts darting between the past and what he might say when he finally saw Monique. As Cora pulled away, he caught a glimpse of Filibert in the rearview mirror, watching him from the side of the road. There was something about the officer's gaze that stuck with him, a look that was more than just the usual caution of an officer on duty. It was almost as though Filibert could see right through him, understanding the burdens he carried. The drive was quiet, but Cora's thoughts grew louder with every mile. Memories of Monique flooded his mind. The way she used to laugh, the small scar on her cheek from when they'd climbed trees as teenagers, her sharp wit that had always kept him on his toes. He remembered how, back then, he'd been a different person, reckless, selfish, and blinded by his own ambitions. Monique had wanted stability, someone she could rely on, but Cora had been too wild, too caught up in chasing dreams that didn't include her. And then there was that one night, the one he still couldn't forgive himself for. It was the last time he'd seen her, the last time he'd said anything to her. His careless words, fueled by frustration and pride, had shattered what they had. She'd left without looking back, and he'd been too stubborn to go after her. The envelope on the seat seemed to pulse with the weight of all those memories, each one a reminder of what he'd lost. The letter inside wasn't just an apology. It was a confession, an admission of the mistakes he'd made and the person he'd become in her absence. He knew it might be too little, too late, but he had to try. Monique deserved to know the truth, and he needed to be free of the guilt that had haunted him all these years. As Cora neared her neighborhood, his hands began to shake. He parked a few blocks away, needing a moment to collect himself. Taking a deep breath, he picked up the envelope, feeling its smooth surface, almost hoping the words would somehow flow into him and give him the courage he lacked. After a moment, he stepped out of the car and began walking toward Monique's house, his heart pounding with every step, his mind racing with thoughts of what he would say, if he'd even have the chance to say anything at all. Cora's steps slowed as he neared Monique Street, a familiar neighborhood that seemed almost frozen in time. The trees lining the sidewalk, the modest houses with well-kept yards. It was as though nothing had changed in all the years he'd been away, yet everything felt different. The last time he had walked this street, he'd been too angry to appreciate the quiet beauty of it, too absorbed in his own frustrations to understand what he was truly leaving behind. He stopped a few houses away from hers, feeling his pulse quicken as he caught sight of her front porch light glowing softly in the dark. The envelope in his hand felt heavy, almost as if it resisted him, like it knew the weight of the truth it held. He clutched it tighter, recalling the painstaking hours he'd spent writing and rewriting, struggling to find words that would express the remorse he felt, the things he'd left unsaid, and the closure he desperately needed. Inside the envelope was a letter that told the story of a young man who didn't know how to love properly. It was a story of regret, of foolish choices made in the heat of anger, of pride that had kept him from seeing what mattered most until it was too late. He'd written about the memories he'd buried for years, about the many times he'd almost picked up the phone to call her, only to put it down, convinced that she wouldn't want to hear from him. But Monique had been different. She'd seen through him, into his heart in a way no one else ever had. She'd been patient, kind, and full of love, a love he'd taken for granted. And that love had been destroyed by his careless words, words he now wished he could take back. It had taken him years to realize the depth of his mistake, to confront the fact that he hadn't just hurt Monique. He'd lost a part of himself in losing her. He had written about the man he had become since then, a man shaped by the pain of his own choices, a man who had finally learned to face his mistakes head-on. He wanted Monique to know he was sorry, that he had changed, and that he hoped she'd find it in her heart to forgive him, not for his sake but for hers, so that she could let go of whatever bitterness or hurt she still carried. Cora felt a pang of fear as he looked up at the porch, wondering if he would be welcome here. Maybe Monique had moved on, married, or even forgotten him entirely. But he knew he had to try. Taking a deep breath, he stepped forward, each footfall echoing in the stillness of the night as he approached her door. When he finally reached it, he lifted his hand to knock, his knuckles hovering an inch from the wood. For a brief moment, he hesitated, questioning if he was truly ready for what lay ahead. Cora's knuckles hovered over the door, frozen mid-air. Every nerve in his body seemed to tense, as if uncertain whether to follow through with this final step. His mind raced, bombarded with questions and second guesses. What if she didn't want to see him? What if this only reopened old wounds she'd worked hard to heal? He could feel his heart pounding, each beat echoing in his ears as he struggled to find the courage to continue. But before he could make up his mind, the door opened. Startled, Cora stumbled back a step, his heart nearly leaping out of his chest. Standing in the doorway was Monique, looking almost exactly as he remembered her. Time had only softened her features, adding a certain wisdom and grace to her face that hadn't been there in their youth. Her hair, now streaked with strands of silver, was pulled back in a neat twist, and her eyes, warm and sharp, fixed on him with a mixture of surprise and curiosity. They stood in silence for a long moment, both seeming to take in the weight of the years that had passed. Cora saw her gaze drop to the envelope in his hand, and he felt a sudden wave of vulnerability wash over him, realizing how exposed he truly was in this moment. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. What could he possibly say that would make up for everything he had left behind? Cora? Monique's voice was soft, almost a whisper, yet it held a strength that steadied him. Is that really you? He nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat as he struggled to find his voice. Yeah, it's me. He held up the envelope, feeling oddly self-conscious. I came to bring you this. It's something I should have given you a long time ago. Monique's eyes shifted to the envelope, and for a moment, he thought he saw something flicker in her gaze. Something unspoken, a memory they both shared. She reached out, taking the envelope from him, her fingers brushing against his in a way that sent a jolt through him. She held it delicately, as though the contents might shatter with the slightest wrong move. Would you like to come in? She asked, her voice calm yet layered with emotion. Cora hesitated, uncertain if he deserved that kind of grace from her. But he nodded, feeling a strange sense of relief and anticipation as he stepped over the threshold into her home. The house was warm and inviting, filled with soft light and the faint scent of lavender. It reminded him of the quiet strength that Monique had always possessed, the way she'd been able to create peace around her even when life was chaotic. He followed her into the living room, where she gestured for him to sit while she took a seat across from him, holding the envelope in her lap. As she looked at him, her eyes softened. You look different, she said quietly, her words laced with curiosity and a hint of nostalgia. Cora managed a weak smile, the weight of his guilt pressing down on him. I suppose I am different. Life has a way of changing you when you've made as many mistakes as I have. He paused, looking down at his hands. I'm sorry, Monique. I know it's been a long time, but this letter, it's the truth I never told you. It's all I have left. Monique nodded, her eyes never leaving his. He could tell she was bracing herself, her fingers tracing the edges of the envelope as if absorbing its meaning before even reading it. And in that shared glance, Cora felt a spark of hope, a faint glimmer that maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late. Monique sat with the envelope in her hands, her fingers brushing its edges thoughtfully, as if the weight of Cora's words was already seeping through. Cora could see her reluctance to open it immediately, as though the act itself might release years of buried pain. For a moment, he felt an urge to pull it back, to take away the burden he was asking her to bear. But he knew that wouldn't give either of them the peace they needed. Cora, she began, her voice steady yet tinged with a fragility that caught him off guard. Why now? After all these years, why are you here with this letter? He sighed, running a hand through his hair. I've asked myself the same question 100 times, he admitted. For years, I told myself it was too late, that you'd moved on and didn't need to be dragged back into my mess. But something changed. I couldn't keep going, carrying the weight of what I did without at least trying to make it right. I guess I finally realized that I couldn't move on without facing the past. Monique nodded slowly, her gaze dropping to the envelope. Her silence was heavy, filled with the unspoken memories they both carried. She glanced back up at him, her eyes searching his face, as if looking for traces of the man she once knew. Do you remember the night we said goodbye? She asked softly, her words wrapped in a distant sadness. Cora's heart twisted. Of course, he remembered. It was a night etched in his memory as clearly as if it had happened yesterday. He nodded, unable to form a response. The images of that evening flooded his mind, the quiet intensity of her voice, the hurt in her eyes, and the anger that had boiled inside him, blinding him to everything he was losing in that moment. Monique continued, her voice calm but weighted with emotion. You were so stubborn, so full of pride. And I think a part of me thought you'd come back, that you'd realize what you were throwing away. But when you didn't, well, I had to find a way to let go. It wasn't easy, Cora. He lowered his head, the sting of regret sharper than ever. I know, Monique, I was a fool. I hurt you. And I've lived with that every day since. This letter, it's not enough to erase the past, but it's my way of showing you that I know what I did. That I know how much I lost when I let you go. A faint, bittersweet smile tugged at her lips as she listened, and Cora could feel the layers of resentment and heartbreak that had built up between them. Monique looked back at the envelope, her fingers tracing it once more before setting it aside for a moment. She didn't need to read it just yet. Perhaps the words were already beginning to reach her heart. Life has a funny way of teaching you us, doesn't it? She murmured, almost to herself. Back then, I thought I'd never be able to face you without feeling anger. But now all I feel is relief. Relief that you're here, that we can finally speak the truth. Cora's chest tightened, a sense of hope flickering within him. He leaned forward, his voice barely above a whisper. Do you think we can find forgiveness in all of this? Monique looked at him thoughtfully, her eyes softening. Maybe, she replied. But forgiveness isn't a single moment, Cora. It's a journey. And maybe, after all these years, we're finally at the beginning of that journey. In that instant, Cora felt something shift. A fragile sense of healing beginning to grow between them, a connection restored, and a glimpse of the forgiveness they both longed for. As Cora and Monique sat in the soft glow of her living room, both quiet in the wake of their heavy conversation, a part of Cora felt a fragile sense of peace starting to bloom. But just as he was beginning to feel the beginnings of relief, there was a soft knock on the door. Monique raised an eyebrow, glancing at Cora with a question in her eyes. She wasn't expecting anyone, and neither was he. But before either of them could speak, the door opened slightly, and Officer Filibert's head appeared around the frame. Sorry to intrude, he said, his voice low, as though he didn't want to disturb whatever was unfolding. I just wanted to make sure everything was all right. Cora's face flushed with embarrassment, feeling as if he'd been caught in a deeply private moment. He hadn't realized Filibert might still be around, much less concerned enough to check on him. But there he was, the officer's familiar, steady gaze meeting Cora's with an understanding that both surprised and comforted him. Monique smiled warmly, gesturing for him to come in. Filibert, right? Cora mentioned you, she said gently, standing to greet him. You're welcome here. Thank you for looking after him tonight. Filibert nodded, stepping inside but keeping his distance, sensing the delicate air between the two. Just doing my job, ma'am, he replied, his gaze shifting between them, taking in the tension and history lingering in the room. But I also wanted to make sure you had the chance to say everything you needed to say, Cora. Sometimes, life doesn't give us second chances, and I didn't want you to walk away tonight without knowing you'd given it everything. Cora looked at him with a mixture of gratitude and awe, realizing just how much this stranger had invested in him. A man he'd only met through an awkward traffic stop. Filibert's words held a quiet wisdom, a reminder that he was here, in this moment, for a reason. I appreciate that, Filibert, Cora said sincerely, glancing at Monique. I came here tonight because I thought it was time to confront my mistakes, to take responsibility for what I left behind. And, because of you, I've been able to start that. Filibert gave a small nod, his expression softening as he looked at Cora. Sometimes, facing the past takes more courage than running from it. Most people never find that courage. But you did. He looked at Monique, his voice calm. And sometimes, forgiveness isn't just for the one who asks. It's for the one who gives it too. Monique's eyes glistened with a new light, Filibert's words striking a chord within her. She had spent years holding onto the remnants of a love she thought she'd buried. Seeing Cora here, vulnerable and apologetic, had stirred something in her she hadn't felt in years. A desire to let go of the bitterness, to set herself free. After a long silence, Monique looked at Filibert and then at Cora. Her expression softened as if a burden had finally lifted from her heart. Perhaps forgiveness is something we can walk toward together, she whispered, glancing at Cora. A step at a time, Cora nodded, overwhelmed with gratitude, feeling a swell of hope he hadn't dared to feel before. In that moment, he realized Filibert's unexpected arrival had offered them both the reminder they needed. Forgiveness was indeed a journey, and maybe, just maybe, they could begin that journey here and now. The room settled into a quiet warmth as Cora and Monique shared a moment of unspoken understanding. Filibert, sensing his purpose had been fulfilled, gave them both a nod and started toward the door. But just as he reached the handle, Monique's voice stopped him. "Filibert, would you mind staying a little longer?" she asked gently. "I feel like you've been part of this, more than either of us expected." Filibert paused, surprised but grateful, and nodded. "Of course. I'd be honored." He returned to his spot near the door, observing Cora and Monique as they settled back into their seats. Cora felt the weight of the moment pressing on him, as if all the years of silence, all the regrets and hidden feelings, were now demanding to be spoken. "I don't know if you'll ever truly understand how sorry I am, Monique," Cora began, his voice barely above a whisper. "I spent so long avoiding what happened between us, telling myself that I could forget it and move on. But I was wrong. I carried the guilt with me every day, even when I pretended not to. And every single time I thought about what I'd lost, I realized it was all my fault." Monique's eyes softened as she listened, her hands clasped in her lap, fingers laced tightly together. She hadn't expected to hear these words tonight, and even though they came years later than she'd once hoped, hearing them now brought a quiet sense of validation and healing. "You know, Cora," she said, her voice steady but gentle, "for a long time I was angry. I told myself that you'd moved on without a second thought, that you'd probably forgotten me the moment you walked away. But I also realized that holding on to that anger was only hurting me. It took a long time, but I had to let it go, piece by piece." Cora felt a pang of guilt, knowing how deeply he'd hurt her. "I wish I could take back every word, every mistake I made. I wish I could go back to that night and stop myself from saying the things I did." He lowered his head, struggling to keep his composure. "But I know I can't. All I can do now is be here, be honest with you, and hope that somehow we can both find peace." Filibert, who had been listening quietly, spoke up. "Sometimes we can't change the past, but we can choose to be better in the future. It's clear that you both have been carrying this weight for too long. Maybe this is the moment to let it go." Monique nodded, her gaze shifting between Cora and Filibert. "You're right. We can't change what happened, but we can decide how to move forward. Cora, I don't expect things to magically heal overnight, but maybe we can take small steps toward something new, toward a forgiveness that doesn't erase the past but lets us live beyond it." Cora's eyes glistened with unshed tears as he looked at Monique, her strength and grace reminding him of the reasons he had fallen in love with her all those years ago. "I'd like that, Monique. I'd really like that." The three sat in silence, the quiet speaking louder than words as they each came to terms with the journey ahead. And in that silence, a fragile peace began to take root, binding them in a shared commitment to the promise of forgiveness and a second chance. The room felt warm with a newfound sense of closure, a peace that had been elusive for both Cora and Monique. Filibert watched them, feeling quietly grateful to have witnessed their journey toward forgiveness. Yet, as he sat there, he felt a weight in his own heart, a burden he tried to push aside but one that had been stirred by Cora and Monique's story. Monique noticed the shift in Filibert's expression, the way his thoughtful gaze had turned inward, lost in a private memory. "Filibert," she asked, her voice gentle, "are you all right?" He looked up, surprised by her question, as though he hadn't realized his own emotions were showing. He managed a small smile but hesitated, as if debating whether to open up. Seeing the invitation in their eyes, he decided to speak. "I guess watching you two tonight, it made me think about my own life," he admitted, his voice low. "It's easy to tell others to let go and move forward, but I've got my own past I haven't fully faced. Sometimes, being on the job, seeing the worst in people, it makes you build walls to keep everything out. But sometimes you end up keeping out the good things too." Cora and Monique listened quietly, sensing the vulnerability in his voice. This composed, strong officer who had just guided them through their own struggles was now, unexpectedly, laying his heart bare. "There was someone I loved once," Filibert continued, his eyes softening with memory. "Her name was Lydia. We were close, really close. But my work, my commitment to it, I let it come between us. I told myself it was for the greater good, that keeping people safe meant more than anything else. But the truth is, I just didn't know how to balance it all. And I pushed her away. Cora nodded in quiet understanding, seeing himself in Filibert's words. Sometimes we don't realize what we're losing until it's gone, he said softly. Filibert sighed, his gaze distant. I thought I could just move on, bury myself in my work and pretend it didn't matter. But there isn't a day that goes by that I don't think about her, that I don't wonder if things could have been different if I tried harder to make it work. Being here tonight, watching you both take steps toward healing, it reminds me that maybe I still have a chance, if I'm willing to face my own mistakes. Monique offered him a sympathetic smile. We're all human, Filibert. And sometimes, the hardest part is forgiving ourselves. If there's one thing Cora and I have learned tonight, it's that facing the past doesn't just free the people we've hurt. It frees us too. Filibert took a deep breath, feeling a weight lift from his chest. Thank you, both of you, he said quietly, his voice filled with sincerity. I didn't expect to find my own kind of peace here tonight, but I think I did. The three of them sat together in silence, bound by a shared understanding and a sense of mutual healing. In that moment, they each felt lighter, their burdens eased by the presence of those willing to listen and understand. For the first time in years, Filibert felt hope. A hope that he, too, could find his way back to the things he'd lost, one small step at a time. As the evening wore on, the trio continued to talk, each story they shared deepening the bond that had unexpectedly formed between them. Cora looked at Filibert with a newfound sense of camaraderie. Despite their age difference, he saw in Filibert a kindred spirit, a man carrying the weight of past regrets, trying to find redemption in the lives they led now. Monique leaned back, her eyes moving from Cora to Filibert, a soft smile on her lips. It's funny, isn't it? She mused. How life brings people together at just the right moments. None of us could have planned this, but maybe this was exactly where we needed to be tonight. Filibert nodded, a contemplative look on his face. Sometimes the people we encounter are exactly who we need to face our own truths. Meeting Cora tonight, it felt random at first, but now, I'm not so sure. Cora chuckled softly. Random or not, I think I needed this more than I realized. I came here thinking it was about making things right with Monique. But this, he gestured around the room, feels like a second chance for all of us. Monique reached over, placing a gentle hand on Cora's. Maybe it's not just about making things right, Cora. Maybe it's about moving forward together, knowing we don't have to carry these burdens alone. Filibert gave a slight nod, his face softening. You're right. None of us can change the past, but we can choose who we become because of it. And I think tonight has shown me that I still have a lot to learn about forgiveness. In that quiet moment, they each felt the weight of their shared experience, a silent agreement to let the night's revelations guide them forward. As the conversations began to wind down, a comforting silence settled over them. They had bared their souls, each revealing the hidden parts of themselves they often kept locked away. Cora felt a calmness that had eluded him for years, a peace that came not from fixing the past but from accepting it. Filibert glanced at the clock, realizing how late it had become. Well, he said, shifting slightly in his seat, I suppose I should let you two have the rest of the evening to yourselves. I didn't mean to intrude this long. Monique shook her head, smiling warmly. You weren't intruding, Filibert. In fact, I think we both needed you here tonight more than we could have known. She looked at Cora, who nodded in agreement. Cora stood and extended his hand to Filibert, his expression sincere. Thank you, officer, for everything. You didn't just pull me over tonight. You helped me face something I've been running from for years. Filibert took his hand, gripping it firmly. And thank you, Cora. Sometimes the people we're meant to help aren't the ones we expect. Monique stood as well, placing a gentle hand on Filibert's shoulder. Remember what you said tonight, Filibert. Forgiveness isn't a destination. It's a journey. Don't let go of that. Filibert gave a grateful nod, his own heart lighter than when he had first stepped into her house. I won't. You two have given me more than you know. With a final goodbye, he left, closing the door softly behind him. Monique and Cora exchanged a look, Their shared understanding deepened, their burdens lessened. In that quiet, they knew this was only the beginning of a new journey. Forgiveness, friendship, and, perhaps, a rekindled love. After Filibert left, the room seemed to exhale, filled with a quiet warmth. Cora and Monique remained standing, both lost in thought, feeling the weight of the evening settle into something softer, something that no longer felt heavy but hopeful. Monique was the first to speak. "It's strange, isn't it? After all these years, facing what happened. It feels like something's finally shifted." Cora nodded, his voice barely a whisper. "I didn't realize how much I needed this. Not just to make things right with you, but to make things right within myself. All these years, I carried regret like it was part of me. But tonight, it feels like I can finally let it go." She smiled, a genuine warmth in her expression. Maybe that's what forgiveness really is. Not just about forgiving someone else, but learning to forgive ourselves. Cora looked at her, his gaze softening. "Monique, I know I have no right to ask this, but do you think there's a chance for us to rebuild what we lost? Or at least to find something new?" Monique's eyes held a mixture of emotions: caution, hope, and a hint of the love that once bound them. "I don't know what the future holds, Cora, but I do know that tonight is a good start." They sat together on the couch, and for the first time, there was no awkwardness or tension, just an ease between them that felt natural, as if time had folded, bridging the years they'd lost. As they talked, sharing stories of the paths their lives had taken, the quiet peace grew, a seed planted in the soil of forgiveness. Whatever tomorrow would bring, they knew that tonight, they'd both found something precious, a new beginning. The hours slipped by as Cora and Monique sat together, talking quietly in the soft glow of her living room. They shared memories from their past, moments both cherished and painful, weaving together fragments of their lives that had once seemed irreparably separated. With each story, each small smile and gentle laugh, they began to rediscover the pieces of each other they'd thought were lost forever. At one point, Monique leaned back, her gaze settling on Cora with a look of gentle curiosity. "Tell me something, Cora," she said softly. "Who are you now, after all this time?" The question caught him off guard, but he met her eyes, thoughtful. "I'm different," he admitted. "I'm not the reckless man I used to be. I've learned how to be still, to listen, to value people in ways I didn't understand before. Losing you taught me a lesson I didn't even know I needed." She nodded, her face touched with both sadness and understanding. "And I've learned to be strong, Cora, to stand on my own. I had to heal, to grow without waiting for anyone else to bring me happiness." They shared a moment of silence, each feeling the profound truth of their words. They were no longer the people they had been. They were older, perhaps wiser, and more at peace with the versions of themselves they'd become. "Maybe that's why we had to go through all of this," Cora murmured, a hint of wonder in his voice. "So we could meet again like this, as new people." Monique smiled, her hand reaching out to cover his. "Then let's take this one step at a time, Cora. No expectations, just rediscovering each other." And in that gentle promise, they found hope for whatever the future might bring. As dawn's light filtered through the window, casting a soft glow across the room, Cora awoke with a sense of calm he hadn't felt in years. The night had been transformative, a quiet, healing kind of night, one that had lifted weights he didn't realize he still carried. He looked around, realizing he'd fallen asleep on Monique's couch, their conversation stretching long into the early hours. Monique entered the room, carrying 2 steaming cups of coffee. She smiled as she noticed him stirring awake. "Good morning," she said, her voice warm, gentle, carrying the ease of old familiarity. Cora sat up, accepting the cup gratefully. "Good morning," he replied, feeling a hint of bashfulness. "I hope I didn't overstay my welcome." Monique chuckled, sitting beside him. "Not at all. It was nice having you here, like finding an old rhythm we'd lost." They sipped their coffee in comfortable silence, each absorbed in thoughts that felt both deeply personal and strangely shared. Monique was the first to speak, breaking the quiet with a gentle honesty. "Last night, It felt like a new beginning for both of yous. Didn't it? Cora nodded, his gaze fixed on her. Yes, it did. I never thought I'd have the chance to rebuild anything with you. I thought forgiveness was something out of reach. She placed a hand on his, her fingers warm against his own. Forgiveness doesn't erase the past, Cora. It lets us shape a different future. She paused, her eyes meeting his, full of quiet hope. Maybe that future holds a friendship, or maybe something more. But either way, it's ours to create. In that moment, they both understood. The past was behind them, but a new path stretched ahead, waiting for them to walk it together. The morning light grew brighter, casting a gentle warmth over Cora and Monique as they sat side by side, savoring the quiet, unhurried moment. There was something beautiful in the simplicity of it. Two people, connected by shared history and newfound forgiveness, ready to explore what lay ahead. Monique turned to Cora, a thoughtful expression on her face. So, what's next for you? She asked, genuinely curious. You came here last night seeking closure, but I think you found something more. Cora smiled, a spark of optimism lighting up his face. You're right, I did. Last night, I felt a part of myself wake up, the part that had been buried under guilt and regret. I think I'm finally ready to move forward with a clear heart. Monique nodded, a pleased look crossing her features. Then let's keep things simple. No rushing, no expectations. Just us, learning to be part of each other's lives again. He reached out, covering her hand with his own, gratitude in his eyes. I couldn't ask for anything more. They sat in silence, a comfortable, contented silence that spoke of trust, the kind that can only be born from enduring hardship and choosing to heal. The day stretched before them, full of promise. Monique suggested a walk through her neighborhood, revisiting old places, familiar streets that had once been a part of their shared past. As they strolled side by side, they spoke of everything and nothing, letting memories surface, laughing about moments they'd long forgotten, and creating new memories that were wholly their own. With each step, they let go of a little more of the past, allowing themselves to embrace this present moment. And with that, their journey toward a future, one shaped by forgiveness and hope, truly began. As they strolled through the neighborhood, Cora and Monique found themselves drawn to the places that had once been part of their lives together. The park where they used to meet on lazy Sunday afternoons, the cafe they had frequented, now remodeled but still cozy. It all felt like familiar ground with a fresh layer of possibility. They stopped at a small bakery, where the scent of fresh bread and pastries wafted through the air. Monique smiled, nudging Cora playfully. Remember how you'd always forget your wallet here? I must have paid for your coffee a dozen times. Cora laughed, a warm, genuine sound. I was smooth like that, wasn't I? He winked, enjoying the light-heartedness between them. But I'll get it this time. Consider it my treat. And maybe a small repayment for all the forgotten coffees. They ordered pastries and coffee, taking a seat by the window. The city bustled around them, but inside, it felt as though time had slowed, giving them a quiet space to rediscover each other. They talked about the little things, the hobbies they'd picked up, books they'd read, funny stories from work. The years apart seemed to fall away, and they found themselves laughing easily, as though no time had passed at all. Monique's face lit up as she shared stories about her work and friendships, and Cora felt a surge of warmth as he listened, genuinely happy to see her so at ease. She looked at him and said, I didn't realize how much I missed this. Just being able to sit and talk with you. Cora reached across the table, taking her hand in his voice soft. Neither did I, Monique. This feels right. And in that moment, surrounded by laughter and the gentle touch of familiarity, they found joy in each other's presence once again. As the afternoon light began to wane, Cora and Monique walked back toward her house, both quiet yet comfortable in each other's presence. The day had brought with it a renewed closeness, something they hadn't expected to find again but now felt like a gift. They shared smiles, exchanged glances, each understanding the other without needing to fill the silence with words. When they reached her front porch, Cora paused, taking a moment to look around, as if seeing everything with new eyes. "Thank you for today, Monique. I didn't know I could feel this at peace again," he said, his voice filled with gratitude. Monique smiled warmly, reaching out to brush a stray leaf from his shoulder. "I feel the same way. It's like we found something we thought was gone forever, and now it's back, stronger somehow." They stood there, close but not touching, the weight of their shared history filling the space between them. Cora felt an urge to tell her everything he was feeling, to speak of the hope and happiness she'd brought back into his life. But he also knew that some things were best left unspoken, left to grow naturally without pressure. "Maybe we could do this again sometime?" he asked, his eyes searching hers. "Just take things slow, one day at a time." Monique nodded, her smile reaching her eyes. "I'd like that, Cora. I really would." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the street, they both understood that they didn't need to rush or define what lay ahead. They had already begun their journey, guided by forgiveness, friendship, and the quiet promise of something new. With a soft goodbye, Cora stepped off the porch, glancing back to see Monique watching him, her eyes reflecting the same quiet hope he felt. In that moment, he knew they'd both found something worth holding on to. Over the next few weeks, Cora and Monique fell into a gentle rhythm of rediscovery. They met often, sometimes for a simple coffee, other times for long walks through the city or quiet evenings at her place. Each meeting was unhurried, filled with easy conversation and comfortable silences that spoke of a shared understanding, a bond neither of them had anticipated finding again. One cool autumn afternoon, they sat on a bench in the park, watching the leaves fall around them in brilliant shades of gold and crimson. Cora looked over at Monique, a warm feeling of gratitude welling up inside him. She had become not only a part of his life again, but a source of hope, of happiness, of stability he hadn't known he'd been missing. "You know," he began, his voice soft, "I never imagined I'd get a second chance like this. For so long, I thought I'd ruined everything. But here we are." Monique smiled, reaching over to take his hand, their fingers intertwining naturally. "We both made mistakes, Cora, but we also both chose to forgive. That's what brought us here." They sat in silence for a moment, watching the world around them, letting the simple beauty of the moment sink in. For the first time in years, Cora felt truly at peace. Not because everything was perfect, but because he had found someone willing to walk beside him, flaws and all, as they ventured into an unknown future. As they rose to leave, Monique squeezed his hand gently. "No matter what happens, Cora, we're in this together. One day at a time." He smiled, feeling the truth of her words resonate deeply. Together, they walked away from the past and toward a future built on understanding, forgiveness, and the promise of love that, like autumn leaves, had found new life in the right season.